For this session, we've got a handout. Does anybody not have the handout yet? Okay, there's one couple there.
Okay, we have a couple back here.
Is this a third?
It's the same handout that was in the previous two sessions. So it's not a new handout. It's the same one in the previous two sessions. And what the handout is an outline or overview of the field of Christian apologetics, showing the subdivisions into offensive and defensive apologetics. And one of the realms of offensive apologetics is natural theology. That's what we've been talking about the last two seminars. We've looked at a cosmological and a moral argument for God's existence. The other subdivision of offensive apologetics would be what's called Christian evidences, which would be an attempt to give reasons to think that the particularly Christian God is the true God. And one of the keys here will be the person of Jesus of Nazareth and the self-understanding of Jesus. And I go into this in much more detail in my book, Reasonable Faith, which has just come off the presses this last week. It has a long chapter in there on the self-understanding of Jesus. And really significant things have been going on among biblical scholars in this area in recent decades. When I wrote the second edition, which was published in 1995, in order to defend the radical self-understanding of Jesus, that is to say, who Jesus thought he was, his radical personal claims, I had to defend simply what is called implicit Christology. I felt that given the state of New Testament scholarship, I could not defend the view that Jesus claimed explicitly to be the Messiah or the Son of God or the Son of Man. Rather, Jesus' self-understanding was to be discerned by his implicit claims that were evident in his ability, for example, to forgive sins or to herald the inbreaking of the kingdom of God into human history, in the authority that he displayed in his teaching with respect to the Old Testament law and the will of God, with respect to his role as an exorcist and as a miracle worker. All of these displayed a divine self-consciousness, an implicit Christology. But what's happened in between the second edition and the third edition is that a great many New Testament scholars today are quite prepared to defend the view that the historical Jesus did in fact believe and claim to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel in the 7th chapter of his prophecy. So in the book I go into much more detail about the developments in New Testament scholarship that have now made these explicit Christological claims once again very historically plausible. So this is an exciting day, not only in philosophy and in science, but also in New Testament scholarship with respect to the quest of the historical Jesus. Now what I want to do today is just briefly give a defense of some of Jesus' radical claims with respect to his consciousness of being the unique Son of God. Jesus' self-understanding as God's unique Son comes to expression in his parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard, which is found in Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Now, one of the keys to this sort of defense of Jesus' radical self-concept will be to show that the words of Jesus to which one is appealing are authentic. That is to say, actually uttered by the historical Jesus. It does no good to quote passages like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me, because New Testament scholars will largely regard those words as inauthentic, as reflecting John's theology rather than the actual words and claims of the historical Jesus. So one will have to master the tools of New Testament criticism in order to use claims of Jesus that have a good plausibility of representing authentic words or sayings that were actually uttered by the historical Jesus. And the parable of the tenants of the vineyard is one such parable. It is recognized even by the radical critics in the so-called Jesus Seminar, who say that only 18% of the words of Jesus recorded in the Gospels are authentic. It is recognized even by them to belong to the authentic words of Jesus, because there's a version of this parable also found in the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of their favorite sources. And therefore, because it's independently attested, they regard this as an authentic parable. But even in its own light, it's a parable that seems to be very plausibly attributed to Jesus himself. It reflects very closely the Jewish Palestinian experience of absentee landlords who have tenant farmers who take care of their crops. In fact, you can show in rabbinic stories parallels to this that are very close to it, so that it really does reflect the historical situation of that day. Now, what is the parable about? Well, the parable, you recall, is about an absentee landlord who owns a vineyard which he lets out to certain tenant farmers. Now, the vineyard is a symbol of Israel that's drawn from the book of Isaiah, and the parable has phraseology that is just lifted right out of Isaiah with respect to God's planting a vineyard, which is the nation of Israel. So the absentee landlord here is God, and the tenants are the Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day who are to be caring for the vineyard. And in the parable, the owner of the vineyard sends his servants to the vineyard to collect its fruit. And the tenants, or rather the servants sent by the landlord, are the various prophets sent by God over history to the owners of the tenants of the vineyard. And the reaction of the tenants of the vineyard in the parable is to refuse to heed these servants sent by the landlord. Instead, they abuse them. They beat them. They send them back empty-handed. They even kill some of them. Finally, the owner of the vineyard says, I have one left to send, my only beloved son. They will listen to my son. But what happens? The tenants of the vineyard say, this is the heir to the vineyard. Let's kill him, and the vineyard will be ours. And so they kill the son and cast him out of the vineyard. Now, what does this parable tell us about Jesus' self-consciousness? Well, it shows us that he thought of himself as the unique Son of God, distinct from all the prophets who have gone before, and even the heir of Israel itself. This is no mere Jewish peasant or rabbinical teacher. This is an extremely powerful demonstration of the radical self-consciousness of Jesus, because it shows that he thought that he was not merely some prophet. He was not merely the Son of God, in which Israeli kings were called God's sons, or even in wisdom literature, a wise man could be called a son of God. Rather, he is the unique Son of God, the only Son. And you cannot eliminate the Son from the parable as an inauthentic later interpolation by the church, because without the Son, the whole point of the parable loses its impact. There is no point if he doesn't send the Son and the Son is killed. Moreover, the fact that the tenants call him the heir shows that he is the unique Son. It reinforces that point. So we have every reason to think that this was always part of the parable, and that it shows Jesus' uniqueness, both from other people who might be called sons of God, with a small s, if you will, and also from any prophet that God might have sent to Israel. Jesus claims to be more than a prophet, more than a son of God. He is the unique Son of God, even the heir of Israel. So this really is a radical demonstration of who Jesus thought that he was, that is very powerful, not only with skeptics, say, or unbelievers, who think of Jesus just as a human teacher or prophet, but also with Muslims, because Muslims are committed to the view that Jesus was a prophet, one of the greatest of the prophets, but superseded by Muhammad, a later prophet. But in the parable, Jesus is the last one to be sent. He is the only Son of the Father and the final messenger to Israel. So this parable is a dagger in the heart of Islam in its view of Jesus and Muhammad. So I find this to be I think this is one of the most powerful claims to divinity that is in the Gospels, is this parable of the tenants of the vineyard. And especially powerful because we have every reason to think this was authentic, that this was something that Jesus actually uttered. Now, Jesus' self-concept as God's unique Son also comes to explicit expression in Matthew 11:27. Matthew 11:27. This is how that saying goes. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Now again, there's good reason to regard this as an authentic saying of the historical Jesus. It's drawn from a very old document which is shared by Matthew and Luke, very often called the Q document. So this is not an original creation of the gospel writers. Rather, they're depending here upon either an oral or a written tradition that precedes them, and therefore goes very far back, close to the life of Jesus himself. Moreover, it's unlikely that the early church would have invented this saying and put it on the lips of Jesus, because it says that the Son is unknowable. It says no one knows the Son except the Father. But as you can illustrate from the gospel, or rather the letters of Paul, the early church believed that we can know the Son. Paul's desire was to know Christ and his sufferings, and to become like him in his death. So you can show easily that the early church did believe that we can know the Son. And yet this saying says the Son is unknowable, only the Father knows him. So it's unlikely that this is a product of early church theology. Rather, this goes back to Jesus himself. But again, what does this saying tell us about Jesus' self-concept? Well, it shows us that he thought of himself as the exclusive and absolute Son of God. This is evident from the definite article, the Son. He thinks of himself as the exclusive and only Son of God. Moreover, he claims to be the only revelation of God the Father to mankind. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son and those to whom the Son has chosen to reveal him. He is the only and exclusive revelation of God the Father, the God of Israel, to mankind. So this is really, really radical stuff. If Jesus was not who he claimed to be, he was crazier than Jim Jones and David Koresh put together, because he thought he was the absolute revelation of God, the Son of God. Finally, one more saying from the historical Jesus, and that's the saying on the date of his second coming that we find in Mark chapter 13 and verse 32. Here's Mark 13 and verse 32. Mark 13:32. Here's how it goes. But of that day or that hour no man knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Now this is, again, highly likely to be an authentic saying of the historical Jesus, because the later church, which attributed divinity to Jesus, would never have invented a saying attributing ignorance to Jesus. And yet this saying says he doesn't know the date of his second coming. Only the Father knows this, not even the Son. And so this suggests that this is a saying of the historical Jesus and not the product of early church theology. But again, what does this saying reveal to us about Jesus' self-consciousness? Well, it shows us he not only thought of himself as the Son of God, again, the definite article shows this, only the Son, but it also, notice, presents us with an ascending scale from men to the angels to the Son to the Father, a scale on which Jesus transcends not only every human being, but even every angelic being, and is proximate to the Father. So this is really incredible stuff. And yet this is evidently what the historical Jesus thought and believed about himself. So in these three sayings, which I would encourage you to memorize the references for, and be prepared to share them with an unbeliever, we see the radical self-consciousness of Christ revealed as the exclusive and only Son of God, who is the revelation of God the Father to mankind. C.S. Lewis was right, I think, when he said this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. Well, much more could be said about this, and in the book I also explore the authenticity of Jesus' claim to be the Messiah, as well as the Son of Man prophesied by Daniel in the 7th chapter of his book, to show the divinity of Christ, or the divinity, rather, of his self-understanding. So I would commend the book to you if you're interested in exploring this further. But right now we want to throw it open for your questions and any discussion. Yes, Mark.
One of the premises of this would be the worth of the Bible, establishing the worth of the Bible before you could go to these, wouldn't it?
No, not exactly. What you have to show is that these are authentic sayings of Jesus. But you don't have to show the general reliability of the Bible or the New Testament, because you can have authentic sayings of a historical personage preserved in some largely unreliable document. Some scholars think, for example, that in the Gospel of Thomas there might be a saying or two of the historical Jesus preserved, even though the rest is just Gnostic garbage. Or in some of the apocryphal Gospels you might find an authentic saying of Jesus. So this is a misunderstanding that I think is very widespread among evangelicals, in that they think you have to give a kind of general demonstration of the reliability of the Gospels before you turn to examining these sayings of Jesus. And that's not the case. What New Testament scholars do today is they don't presuppose the general reliability of the Gospels. They treat them like ordinary historical sources from antiquity, and then they apply to them certain tests to try to see what parts are authentic and what parts are inauthentic. And even the Jesus Seminar grants that 18% of these words attributed to Jesus are authentic. And what we want to argue is that among those authentic sayings, or shall we put it this way, among the demonstrably authentic sayings of Jesus, since I think that even the ones that can't be demonstrated to be authentic, I think they are authentic, but among the demonstrably authentic sayings of Jesus, there are sayings that reveal to us this radical self-consciousness. So we do have to do the spade work, but I tried to do a little bit of that with you here today to show why these sayings, these three sayings, ought to be regarded as authentic. Yes, in the back.
I'm worried about the Matthew 11 passage, and I guess I'm wondering why we have to think Jesus is actually claiming to be the revelation of God, and why he can't just claim to be the one who uniquely has a certain kind of knowledge of God that he's passing on, revealing it now.
Well, because the saying implies there is no knowledge of God the Father apart from what Jesus gives. No one knows the Father except the Son and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So it says right there that apart from the revelation of Jesus, there is no knowledge of God the Father. In fact, this makes me uncomfortable, because I would have thought, don't the prophets reveal to us God the Father? Aren't there other sources of revelation? But that's how radical this saying is, that Jesus says that there is no knowledge of God the Father apart from what the Son reveals. So it's a very radical saying. Yes?
Would the miracles that he has performed also would attribute to his authenticity?
Yes, and in the book I discuss the fact that New Testament criticism today recognizes miracles to belong to the historical Jesus. Once upon a time, it was thought that these miracles were reflections of pagan mythology. And you still hear this among the internet infidel crowd and the sort of free thought group, who are stuck in this scholarship of the 18th century. It was once thought that Jesus was being assimilated to ancient heroes and divine men like Hercules and others. And so miracles were attributed to him under the influence of Greco-Roman and other pagan myths. In fact, that has been completely abandoned in contemporary New Testament scholarship. It is recognized that the proper framework for understanding the historical Jesus is not pagan mythology. It is first century Palestinian Judaism. Jesus was a Jew and has to be understood as a Jew against that background. And in that context, his miracles are quite believable. The fact that he was a miracle worker is quite believable in the sense that, say, Oral Roberts or Catherine Kuhlman was a miracle worker. They're not making a judgment as to whether these were miracles. They would say that's something that we can't judge. But in the sense that he was a miracle worker, that he went about healing people, and that he was an exorcist, now belongs firmly to the portrait of the historical Jesus. And these miracles are significant not simply because Jesus thought he had the power to heal people and raise dead people to life, but also because these miracles were signs of the inbreaking of the kingdom of God in his person. The centerpiece of Jesus' proclamation was the inbreaking of the kingdom of God into human history. And the exorcisms and the miracles were signs that the kingdom of God was coming into human history in his person. So you're absolutely right that this is part of what I called implicit Christology that reveals to us the self-understanding of Jesus. Right. I'm not overly concerned with that because I think that the Bible is not a book on systematic theology, and therefore it's up to us to sort of systematize it, to figure it out. And so what we would say would be that Jesus is talking about perhaps the deepest essence of who God the Father is, and that has never been fully displayed by any prophet or person in the past. But in Jesus we do really see the essence of who God is. And this would then make a framework, you see, in which a saying like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say to me, Philip, show us the Father? That makes a saying like that look more plausibly authentic, doesn't it, in light of this other authentic saying? So that can then form a bridge to these more radical Johannine theological statements that now begin to look plausibly authentic in this light. So I'm not overly concerned with that, but would say that if you do systematic theology, you're going to need to do some finessing on this to make sense of it. Yes?
With the following statement, he's invitation for people to come to him, learn from him, and to take his yoke. Would that be considered inauthentic?
I don't know.
That's the next statement he makes.
Oh, is it?
Learn from me.
What is the previous statement?
Well, the one that no one knows the Father.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And the next statement is his invitation for
Yes.
to come to him and learn from him.
Yeah. I have never, frankly, studied that other saying, so I don't know what the general opinion is about that. These sayings, as this question illustrates, come one by one. It's not as though you have a whole discourse that one will say, aha, if one sentence is authentic, that gives you the whole thing. Every verse in the New Testament is a battleground today. And each one has to be fought for and gained one at a time. So I don't know the answer to that question.
But that would make the rest of the New Testament claims not in contradiction.
Yes, you're right, because he's saying, I reveal the Father, so come to me and learn of me, and you will learn more about this. Yeah, good. Yes?
I've always been bothered by the passage where Jesus doesn't know something.
Right. Well, monarchianism, as I recall, was more a form of modalism, which is the view that there's only one person that God is, but that they they exhibit themselves, or he exhibits himself in different ways.
Well, modalism is, as you said, monarchianism is the belief of one of the.
Yeah, there's one highest God who reveals himself in different ways. But in any case, I think that what one wants to say here is that in the state of humiliation, as theologians refer to Jesus' incarnate state up to the time of his death, during the state of humiliation, he clearly was in a position where he had an ordinary human consciousness that didn't know everything. So I think it wasn't just the date of his second coming that Jesus was ignorant of. If you had asked him about auto mechanics or quantum mechanics, I don't think he would have known the answer to those questions either. Consciously. Now, the way I put this together with omniscience is to say that in Jesus' subliminal consciousness, he had knowledge of all of these things. But it wasn't in his waking consciousness. Human personality is much more than the surface consciousness that we exhibit. We have deep springs of our behavior in our subliminal consciousness, in our subconscious and unconscious. And we often will know things subconsciously that we cannot retrieve in conscious thought. And I think that it's not implausible to say that the incarnation involved the subordination of a lot of this divine knowledge in the divine subliminal of Jesus, and his waking consciousness exhibited an authentic human experience. And that explains, for example, how he can be really tempted, or how, as a baby, he can grow into a boy and increase in knowledge and wisdom, as Luke says he did. How he, as the book of Hebrews says, he learned obedience through what he suffered. All of those things would be understandable if we have this model of a consciousness and a subconsciousness. If you're interested in that subject, I've written on this in the book Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview in the chapter on the Incarnation. Yes?
You mentioned about some, in regard to Matthew 11:27, the doctrine of Q verifying that.
Yeah.
Have they found the doctrine of Q, and how can they verify it?
Yeah, no, there hasn't been found any such document Q, and there may not be such a document. It's hypothetical. It's based upon the fact that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources, and so you could pull out of Matthew and Luke all the Markan stuff, all the stuff they got from Mark, and then look at what's left over. And what you'll have left over will exhibit a great deal of overlap between Matthew and Luke. Now, if Matthew and Luke were written independently of each other, and you take out all the Markan stuff, and there's still this area of overlap, the suggestion is they must have had a common source for that material. Whether that was an oral source or a written source, nobody knows, but the idea is that Matthew and Luke had another source in addition to Mark that they drew upon, and it's been called Q arbitrarily. And this would be regarded as a very early source of information. And in gospel studies, the further back you can drive to the life of Jesus by finding these sources, the better, historically speaking, your case for authenticity is, because the window of opportunity for legend and accretion narrows. So that's why that's significant. Now, this case for the existence of Q would evaporate if Matthew and Luke are not independent. It's not, I think, improbable that Luke may have used Matthew, in which case it would be that Matthew just borrowed this material, or rather that Luke just borrowed the material from Matthew as well as from Mark. But that's not the majority view today. The majority view is that Matthew and Luke are independent and drew upon a common source in addition to Mark. Was there another comment about that particular issue? Yes.
Could that mysterious Q document be, say, Jesus himself, and not a document at all?
Well, it wouldn't be Jesus himself. Well, you mean that he wrote them down?
No, not that he wrote them down, but you said it could have been an oral tradition. Could that oral
Right.
tradition have been
Yes, exactly. That's right. And so you have to phrase this carefully. Say it was Jesus himself would be to say that Jesus, wrote this down or wrote the document. We don't want to say that, but what you would want to say is what you just said, is that this is an oral tradition that goes right back to the sayings of Jesus himself. And is a say. Many people think it is just that. It is a saying source of sayings of Jesus that were memorized and transmitted orally, and then Luke and Matthew both draw upon this tradition and put it into written form. So that is quite right, what you're saying. And don't be misled by some contemporary people who think of oral tradition as like the child's game of telephone, where the message gets more and more distorted until it rapidly becomes nonsense. That's not the way Jewish transmission of traditions worked. In an oral culture like first century Palestine, the ability to memorize and faithfully transmit great bodies of material was a highly developed and highly prized skill. And in fact, the eyewitnesses were still around who could correct any departures from the authentic tradition. So in one sense, it's not even what is called oral transmission, it's what's called oral history, where the original people are still there to say, no, that's not what he said, you got it wrong, and to correct it. Any other question? All right, well, okay, one more and then we'll close.
It's a little off the point, but it's connected.
I don't know the answer to that. I've often puzzled over that too. But what Christ does seem to rejoice in there is that God has hid it from the proud and those who esteem themselves something, and he's revealed it to the babes and the humble. And I think that Jesus delights in this because it is those who are poor in spirit and contrite in heart who are the ones that find God and come to know him, not the proud and the boastful and the self-righteous. So I think he delights in that. But beyond that, I'm not sure what to say. It does seem to me that other parables, like the parable of the Pharisee and the publican who go in to pray, and the Pharisee congratulates himself on all he's doing, whereas the publican won't even lift his eyes to heaven, but just says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says, this is the man who went away righteous, not the first. He delights in the fact that the humble and the contrite come to know God. Well, again, if you're interested in learning more about these radical claims of Jesus and his radical self-concept, have a look at the chapter in Reasonable Faith, or go to the website reasonablefaith.org. And just let me close by saying what is especially significant is that the radical personal claims form the historical context in which the resurrection of Jesus occurs. And they provide the interpretive meaning of the event of the resurrection. If this man, who claimed to be the absolute revelation of God the Father, has been raised from the dead, then this is a radical, public vindication by the God of Israel, who was allegedly blasphemed by Jesus, that these claims were in fact true. So like a hand in a glove, the radical claims of Jesus and the resurrection go together to vindicate the radical self-understanding that Jesus had.
That's all in your book.
That's in the book.